We all like receiving plaudits. So I suspect that there were quite a few Jamaicans who were pretty chuffed when, at the end of their most recent IMF program, they were given the following commendation.
I'm here really to say congratulations. Congratulations for 6.5 years of a partnership with us, but more importantly, a successful program that has helped Jamaica and helped the Jamaican people. You owe it to yourself, to nobody else. And what you've achieved is remarkable. Through 2 programs, 2 different administrations, with very strong commitment, and you've managed to actually create jobs, to reduce the unemployment level to the lowest level ever. You've reduced debt by 50 percentage points of GDP. You've managed to stabilize inflation, and you've managed to accumulate reserves, which will be helpful in case there is another shock. Those are incredible achievements. Final touch. There are issues, such as violence, such as crimes, that still hold the Jamaican society and economy. Clearly, having gone through those programs, having accumulated reserve, being in a much safer fiscal position, will help governments actually try to deal with these issues, try to address the social needs. And that's what I really wish for Jamaica and the Jamaican people.
Really? 6.5 years, 2 programs, 50% of GDP, and 2 administrations? Really? If you look at Jamaica's engagement with the IMF over recent decades, you can see there's very clearly 2 periods. And in that second period, you can see that there are not 2, but 3 IMF programs, the first of which is by far the largest. And then maybe my maths is a little bit off, but I calculate that as 48 percentage points of GDP reduction in debt, not 50. And I think that these people would have something to say about the claim that there's only 2 administrations involved in all this. Well, you might say, no big deal. She's only speaking generally. She's reading from a teleprompter as she rushes out the door to her next political position in Europe. No big deal. But my mother was a bookkeeper, and one of the things I learned from her is that very big discrepancies hide in very small ones. And to see those big discrepancies in Jamaica start by looking at Jamaica's macro framework over this decade of its engagement with the IMF. Here you can see its GDP growth rates, output falling, of course, in the context of the Great Recession, and then very lackluster growth thereafter, all the way through 2019, showing that even after a full decade of IMF supervision, Jamaica can only manage to grow at a little over 1%. Then its gross fixed investment numbers, showing no great recovery going on under IMF supervision. Indeed, actually these ratios are declining. Inflation has stabilized rather nicely at moderate levels, a significant achievement of the Bank of Jamaica in this context. And then you can see these absolutely eye-popping primary balance numbers. Extremely high. And if you think of what's going on in the Great Recession, you have a headline primary balance of 6.2 in 2009 with output falling by 3.5%. In structural terms, that's a primary of, I don't know, maybe 8, something like that. Extraordinary numbers occurring in the context of elevated public debt numbers in Jamaica. Indeed, that is the motivation for these primary balance numbers that have been realised. And indeed, you can see there that debt has declined by about 48 percentage points of GDP over this period. And in that context, you can see that the external balance was very weak during the Great Recession, but has since strengthened considerably. Putting that in longer context, you compare on the far right-hand side the average for 09 to 19 with on now the left-hand side the average of a long pre-period. Well, under a decade of policies under IMF supervision at 09 to 19, GDP growth was just 0.2, well below its previous performance in previous decades, what I consider to be Jamaica's wild and crazy years prior to all of this. And you can see again to note in 2019 that the outturn is still, even after a cumulative decade of IMF administrations, not achieving the growth rates achieved in the wild and crazy years of 08 and previously. Fixed investment is scored a little lower than it did in those years. Inflation, again, nicely stabilised by the Bank of Jamaica in recent years, but compared to earlier performance. You can also see, comparing the current decade to previous decades, that Jamaica has been running primary surpluses for a very long time at extremely high rates. And that is because debt has been a long-standing issue. And one can see again that the external performance has improved under this. Now, there are some people who look at these numbers and say to themselves, why is Jamaica growing so slowly? Indeed, that's a question that the IMF poses. But when I first encountered these numbers, my question wasn't that. My question was, how on earth is Jamaica growing at all in these circumstances, particularly with such an extreme set of primary surplus numbers? And the reason why I asked that question when I first encountered these numbers is because I came to Jamaica having been rather badly burned by Greece. And if you look at the Greek numbers over the same period, you can see what I'm talking about. From 2008, there was an absolutely catastrophic drop in Greek output. That's a cumulative total to 2015 of 25%, a 25% drop in the level of GDP in Greece. And since barely entering into recovery territory after that. And that occurred in the context of extremely unusual primary balance numbers. You can see that Greece's primary moved from a deficit of 10% of GDP to a surplus of 4% of GDP in 2017. That's in less than a decade, a 14 percentage point of GDP adjustment. That was occasioned because, of course, Greeks had, like you did in Jamaica, elevated public debt levels at the beginning, but obviously those public debt levels have ended up being a great deal higher even after all of this effort, this fiscal effort by Greece. Now, there are those, and indeed this is the conventional opinion with regard to Greece, who would say, well, the reason why Greece's output fell quite so dramatically as it did by 25% in those years is because the primary balance was changing. It's a story of the change in the primary, operating through standard multiplier effects, operating on the demand side of the economy. So as you withdraw demand, as the primary moves from -10 to +4, so via multipliers, output takes a very severe hit. But if that is your story for Greece, then an implication of that story is that with demand causing a contraction of output by 25% over this period, and that's the only story you're telling, then the implication would be that nothing is going on the supply side in Greece, which would imply that an enormous output gap is opening up of 25% of GDP or so in up to 2015. And in that context, you would expect, would you not, to see inflation falling like a stone. But you don't. There are the Greek inflation numbers. And you can see that when output was falling its fastest in the early period here for Greece, inflation was actually rising. So what those inflation numbers are telling you for Greece is that the primary balance change was not only affecting the demand side, it was also affecting the supply side. That just as demand was contracting as a result of these actions, so potential supply was also contracting precipitously as a result of those changes in the primary balance. And how does that work? Well, to get from -10 to +4, to give a simple example, you have to slash real health spending in Greece. So now people are sick and they're not producing. That is affecting the potential supply. Similarly, to make a change of that magnitude, you have to significantly increase the burden of taxation on this economy, discouraging via conventional means activity and output. That's affecting potential output. So it's quite clear that in order to really understand the story of Greece, you have to not simply tell a demand side story, you have to tell a supply side story, which is connecting the primary balance to output. So through that lens, now you come back to look again, take a second look at Jamaica, with this Greek story in the back of your head. And here you see that Jamaica doesn't have enormous changes in the primary balance, as Greece did, although I would point out that from 2011 to 2015, the primary changed by 4 percentage points of GDP, a not insignificant change, but it's not 14% of GDP. The story in Jamaica is that you have a very high level of the primary surplus rather than a very big change in the primary balance. But it's not hard to intuit how a very high level of the primary balance could also be extremely damaging to the Jamaica's supply side, to its potential. Again, to use the simple example I used, if Jamaica is running primary surpluses of up to 7% of GDP, well, it's not spending that money on health. So Jamaicans are sick relative to Jamaica's country peers. Those are at the same GDP per capita as Jamaica, which are not running a big primary there and which are spending on health and which are therefore boosting their supply side. You can tell the same story on the tax side. If you've got running a very high level of the primary, that is reflecting a very high level of the burden of taxation to make that happen relative to Jamaica's country peers. And that is discouraging the normal entrepreneurial activities of business. So you establish an intuition which says there's not, through Greece and Jamaica, that there's not only a connection between the primary balance and the demand side, but there's also a connection between the primary balance and the supply side and supply potential. And that connection to the supply side doesn't only happen when you change the primary balance significantly, which is what Greece did, but it also happens when you have simply a sustained high level of the primary surplus, as you do in Jamaica. Greece and Jamaica thus make an extremely compelling pair of cases to look at together about the connection between what's going on in the primary balance of the budget and what's going on with, in Greece in the first instance, the level of GDP, and in Jamaica with the growth rate of GDP. So we can see that there is a connection. In the case of Jamaica, its primary balance hitting the supply side. And we know that it's primarily operating through the supply side in Jamaica because the inflation numbers are moderate and stable. If it was doing something else, you would not expect to be seeing those stable numbers. Demand is broadly tracking supply in Jamaica. Jamaica has a supply side problem, not a demand problem. Okay, so how big is that effect in Jamaica? How big is that supply side problem? It's nice to have all these intuitions, but we'd like to get a handle of some order of magnitude of the numbers involved. To do that, you have to compare Jamaica over this period with its macroeconomic peers. To do that, you can't do a peer comparison of the sort of brainless type that the IMF typically does. The IMF, when it does peer group comparisons, looks to neighbours, geographic neighbours, compares them and says, well, they're doing this and Jamaica's doing that. No, you can't compare to its geographic neighbours. You have to compare to its macroeconomic peers. And Jamaica's macroeconomic peers are in Africa. And there's a second thing you have to do differently from the standard, rather brainless IMF approach to peer group comparisons. For this exercise, you're doing an examination of IMF-approved policies in Jamaica over a decade. Well, the IMF is supposed to be the brightest hotshots economists in the world. They ought, you might think, to be able to match, through their prescriptions and performance, the best of Jamaica's macroeconomic peers in Africa. So not a random group of Africans with all their clutter of problems. No, you should compare Jamaica, following these IMF prescriptions, to the best of the Africans which constitute Jamaica's macroeconomic peers. And even doing that doesn't establish the frontier. Because if you go to all of those African countries, you will see that the IMF is saying to all of them that they should change their policies to do even better. So this is not a particularly demanding standard to set when doing a peer group comparison of Jamaica to the best African peers. So what does that kind of peer group comparison for Jamaica show? Well, at the same time as Jamaica was following over a decade these IMF prescriptions, here you see 3 African countries and their growth performance in exactly the same global macroeconomic environment that the IMF policies in Jamaica were confronting. You can see Ethiopia on a tear, and here you have Kenya and Uganda also performing very strongly. That is real output up by over 70% in that decade. Well, you might say, that's all very well, but these 3 countries have a GDP per capita below Jamaica. So you shouldn't expect Jamaica to be performing under IMF policies quite so well. So you supplement that with a group of Jamaica's peers in Africa with a GDP per capita higher than Jamaica. Here we have Mauritius, Botswana and Namibia. And we see that over that same decade, you've got output there rising by some 50%. Intuitively speaking, you would expect Jamaica to be somewhere between these two, between not growing quite as fast as the best performers who have a GDP per capita below Jamaica, perhaps growing a little faster than those Africans which have a GDP per capita higher than Jamaica. So where is Jamaica on this map? Under IMF policies. There is Jamaica. It is a yawning gap. And then there will be obviously concerns to say, well, what about doing this in per capita terms? That's just real GDP. What does that show? Well, that shows that, in fact, GDP per capita under IMF policies for a decade has actually dropped. While these other countries are securing a growth in their GDP per capita of something like 30%. And you have to realize that when you do this calculation in per capita terms, this understates the gap. Why? Because as these policies were having this deleterious effect in Jamaica, you had emigration, net emigration from Jamaica. The population was falling under these policies. And the reverse is true in these most successful African countries. Because they were doing well, they had net immigration. The population was actually expanding because of these policies. This is why the headline to take away from these numbers is that the gap between Jamaica and its performance under a decade of following IMF policies relative to its African peers, its best performing African peers, is something like 40 percentage points of GDP in 2008. That is an absolutely enormous number. Strictly speaking, what this implies is, had Jamaica merely followed the average of those policies done by the best Africans, instead of following the policies advocated by the IMF, its GDP per capita now would be much, much higher. Indeed, relative to 2008, it would have risen by something like 40 percentage points instead of dropping. Where Greek output fell by 25%, Jamaica has suffered output foregone of approximately 40% of GDP. That is why I call this macroeconomic malpractice imposed by the IMF. It's a very strong word. And it's a word which, of course, the IMF itself is very anxious to contest. They say, if you really want to understand what's going wrong with Jamaica and why its growth is as it is, you have to move this primary elephant out of the way to see what's really going on behind the picture. Now, I've been into the belly of the beast, into the IMF to make this case, and they offer 3 explanations for this enormous shortfall to explain why it's those things and not the primary balance which is doing the damage. So the first explanation they come up with, and you heard this from the managing director herself, is crime. Jamaica has a problem with crime, which is causing its growth problems. Well, just think about that for a little. It cannot have come to any surprise to those IMF economists who showed up in Kingston in 2009 to design the first of those IMF programs that Jamaica has a problem with crime. And if the problem with crime is producing a GDP shortfall over a decade of 40 percentage points, then crime is macro-critical. It should be incorporated into the program, which should be very tough on crime and very tough on the causes of crime. But it wasn't. And why wasn't it? Because there's a very high primary surplus target. So you cannot spend on law and order, you cannot reduce taxation to reduce the incentives to evade tax, and you cannot use a lower primary to spur growth in order to give people an alternative to crime. So you are, from this explanation, drawn right back to the problem being with the primary surplus target. And not only that, but this explanation takes no account of your African peers. Now, many of them, Botswana, Namibia, and Mauritius, are certainly relatively crime-free. But if you imagine that Kenya is crime-free, then you haven't spent much time in the shanty towns of Nairobi lately. So, crime as an explanation for this performance simply draws you right back to the problem being the primary. What about the second explanation, which the IMF have offered to move this pink elephant off the screen and blame something else for Jamaica's growth performance? Well, says the IMF, Jamaica has hurricanes, and hurricanes hurt growth. But once again, I say, it cannot possibly have come as a surprise to those hotshot IMF economists who showed up in Kingston in 2009 that Jamaica is in Hurricane Alley. And if hurricanes are causing a discrepancy of output relative to your peers of 40% of GDP over a decade, that is macro-critical. So why doesn't that program, starting in 2009 and its successors, have a heavy engagement with hurricane preparation and hurricane recovery expenditures? Answer, because of a very high primary surplus target. So once again, one is drawn right back from this alternative explanation to the primary to explain Jamaica's poor performance. And again, this takes no account of your comparison with the African peers. It is true, the African peers do not have hurricanes, but they have something else, which in many ways is even worse, which is drought. And yet they perform much better than Jamaica has under its IMF policies and these very high primary surplus numbers. And then because those arguments have been thus refuted, the IMF resorts to a third completely remarkable argument, which says that the reason Jamaica grows so slowly is because of your practice of corporal punishment of children. I kid you not. This is in their staff report. Now, I can assure you, without fear of contradiction, that the IMF knows precisely nothing about the connection between corporal punishment behaviour and growth. But yet again, there's even no comparison with your African peers, and whether rates and behaviour of corporal punishment are any different over there. There is one further set of stories which have been offered to explain why it's not the primary doing all of this, which comes from a recent set of articles published in the Financial Times. But those arguments are so ridiculous, I'm not going to devote any time to them here. If you want me to go through why they don't work either, we can do that in personal correspondence. But what about the explanation that is emerging here, that it is the primary balance and those high surplus numbers which are impairing Jamaica's growth? Are Jamaica's numbers on the primary significantly different from those of its African peers? Well, here is your set of primary balances. Surpluses ranging there from 5 up to 7% of GDP, now around 6. And here are the primary balance numbers of those African best performing peers with a GDP per capita below yours. There is a yawning gulf between these sets of numbers. And just to give you an intuition about just how big this is, that is a difference of about 8 or 9 percentage points of GDP. So if this was the United Kingdom we were talking about, and it was trying to make a fiscal adjustment of 8 to 9 percentage points of GDP in order to move from what these best performing African peers are doing to you, the UK would have to completely shut its NHS. That money doesn't get spent on something else, health and education or whatever. That just goes to creditors. So there is an enormous gulf between the primary behaviours going on in Jamaica and those in your best performing African peers. What about those countries African countries with a GDP per capita above yours? What are their primary balances? And there again, you can see that they too are doing things completely differently from what happens in Jamaica. All of this evidence and theory is pointing to the fact that the culprit for Jamaica's sustained long-term poor growth performance is its primary surpluses. And those are put there to deal with Jamaica's debt problem. And the point to take away from this examination of Jamaica's macroeconomic performance in the last decade is not that you've done well, I'll come back to that, but is the enormous output cost of pursuing the IMF's present set of arrangements for dealing with highly indebted countries. It has cost Jamaica 40 percentage points of 2008 GDP over a decade. That is the output foregone due to the present arrangements for dealing with sovereign insolvency. And what makes the Jamaican case so important in this context is the fact that you stuck to that IMF medicine. You persisted. So that it enables people like me to see what the output costs of that medicine are. It allows us to quantify them, not just for you, but for the broader discussion about how those sovereign insolvency arrangements need to be reformed. Jamaica, in this regard, is absolutely critical. So, where does the story go from here? Well, the first thing to say is that Jamaica is in a debtor's prison. And that is no rhetorical hyperbole. Just think back to Dickensian England when creditors threw a seamstress into jail for not paying her debts. Well, when she's in jail, she can't make any dresses. That is output foregone. But creditors were quite happy to do that to her because by doing so they could put more pressure on her family and relatives to stump up the money and get their money back. And that is exactly what is happening to Jamaica. Your creditors, which include a bunch of official financial institutions with the letter D in their name, D for Development, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, the Inter-American Development Bank, are through the IMF imposing upon you a set of primary surpluses which are extremely harmful to output. And they're doing so because that is how they get their money back. In short, they prioritize, despite being development institutions, the repayment of their own claims on Jamaica rather than the development of Jamaica. The second point to make, and I'm very sad to make this, is that you are not done yet with this. I think you have about another decade ahead of you, given the present global arrangements for sovereign insolvency. But that's not, of course, what the IMF projections show at the moment, is it? They show now that in 5 years' time, Jamaican public debt will have fallen to something like 60% of GDP. Sounds good. But those projections assume that Jamaican primary surpluses will remain at 6% of GDP forever. And those projections ignore that with the primary remaining that elevated, that GDP will not grow faster. But showing that it does grow faster, of course, helps the mathematics of all of this to show debt ratios falling. And that's still not it. Because in this context, they assume that nothing else happens to Jamaica in the meantime. So no renewed problem with crime, no renewed problem with hurricanes. And in particular, they ignore a great shock which is hitting Jamaica right now, which is coronavirus. If you add in all these things which are inevitably going to happen as you go along, Jamaica has, I would guess, another decade where, under the present sovereign insolvency arrangements, you are giving up something like 40 percentage points of present year GDP. And having said all that, I need to make one other point extremely clear. There is nothing in what I have said today which is critical of the Jamaican authorities. Nothing. To the contrary, I am awestruck at the strength of the Jamaican political system to be able to sustain these high primary balances without falling apart. I was an IMF chief for many years, and I can tell you I would have given my eye teeth to come across a set of authorities this committed to taking tough medicine. This is not the medicine that I would have prescribed to Jamaica had I shown up in 2009. I would have prioritised action on law and order. I would have prioritised hurricane preparation and recovery. I would have prioritised getting tax rates down to stimulate business. That's what I would have done. But the IMF at the time prescribed something very different. I say again, I am awestruck at the ability and commitment of the Jamaican authorities, all four of those administrations, to sustain such tough medicine. So, to be crystal clear, had I been parachuted into Kingston in 2009 as the Minister of Finance, I would have done as the Minister of Finance then broadly did. I would have swallowed this medicine, even in full knowledge of its cost in terms of output forgone. Why? Because the alternatives presented to me and back then were even worse. That is a severe indictment, not of the governments of Jamaica, but of the present sovereign insolvency arrangements, which prioritise the payment of debt above the securing of output potential. The third point to make is that in regard to all of this, you in Jamaica are not alone. Even within the Caribbean region, Barbados is now having primaries of 6% of GDP imposed on it too by the IMF, also motivated by the recovery of debt under the present global sovereign insolvency arrangements. And it doesn't stop there, because there are a slew of countries in Africa where similarly the IMF is eyeing extremely high primary surpluses to be imposed on countries to secure debt payments. And in all of them, according to this evidence from Jamaica, there will be severe output foregone costs. And these costs of the present sovereign insolvency arrangements worldwide are thereby an impediment to global growth. At a time when there is an extremely high premium on increasing global growth. So this problem goes far beyond Jamaica. It goes to the global level and also to many countries in Africa and elsewhere. There is need to completely reconfigure the sovereign insolvency arrangements so that they prioritise output potential above debt repayment. And I'm afraid you cannot expect the government of Jamaica itself to make this case internationally. Just like our seamstress when thrown into prison, she is in no position to make a fuss to the creditors who hold her in jail. If she does, the creditors who are vindictive will make her life even worse. The people who have to make this case are not the governments who are in these debtor prisons, but are the group of economists, a collection of people like you, to understand that this is the predicament and to join together to make the case that this set of arrangements is not globally appropriate. And also to note that there is a very good reason why debtors' prisons no longer exist, which is that for corporates and individuals, because there was a rising up of people in protest. It is time for the same to happen for these sovereign insolvency arrangements. And that protest has to come from groups of professional economists. That means those of you in Jamaica who understand the predicament that your country has been in, joining with groups of economists in Africa who are about to enter into this predicament, to jointly rise up and make the case that this has to change. And such efforts are being made to draw the attention of African economists to this problem. I strongly urge you to join my efforts and those of my colleagues to make this connection and make this effort. And my last point. But is there actually an alternative? Can one map out a different way of doing this at a global level that a group of economists can get together and get behind? Well, the answer to that question is yes. I have done so. In the very last slide on this presentation, you'll see a hot link to my article which does this. But the principles are very simple. I have taken the insolvency arrangements that have been applied to US banks for the last over half a century, very successfully, which do this, which preserve output against creditors. And they have done this very successfully for US banks. And I simply map those arrangements onto sovereigns. So this is not an arrangement which is sort of dreamt out of thin air by some economist. It is looking at actual insolvency arrangements which have been applied in practice, in detail, very successfully, and extending them to sovereigns. And that means that when you consider those specific proposals, and certain problems and so on may occur to you, what about this, what about that? The first question to ask is, if that is such an impediment to these proposals, why hasn't it been an impediment in the case of banks in the US? Why hasn't whatever this problem I'm thinking of arisen in the case of US banks? And you will see that in fact there is a perfectly feasible set of alternatives, technically feasible set of alternatives to sovereign solvency arrangements which preserve output rather than preserving debt. And the point of doing so is that the present regime of sovereign insolvency is so expensive in terms of output foregone, as the last decade in Jamaica clearly demonstrates.